So as we continue our argument unit and learn more about writing arguments, it's important that we're able to understand and eventually write counterarguments and refutation. So that's what this video is going to be about. We're going to look at a couple of places where we have already identified counterarguments. We're going to talk about more formal definitions for counterargument and refutation, look at a couple of examples, and then we're going to wrap up with you identifying counterargument and refutation on your own in somebody else's writing. So first, I want to take a quick look at the article that we started this unit with, Losing is Good for You, from the New York Times. So this is my copy with some of my notes, and if you remember, the central claim of this piece is this right here. We had talked about the claim that awards can be powerful motivators, but nonstop recognition does not inspire children to succeed. Instead, it can cause them to underachieve. So the claim being this idea that constantly rewarding children in particular can actually have some negative impacts. And at the time, we did talk about counterargument briefly. I had you guys complete a graphic organizer, and we did note a counterargument. So it's actually right here on the screen. You can see the red dot here. However, when it comes to rewards, people argue that kids must be treated identically. Everyone must always win. So as I'm reading that, you can hear that it is opposing the central claim of the piece, the idea that everyone has to be treated the same and everyone must always win would kind of indicate that awards are good things. Then we quickly see the author refute that. That is misguided, and there are negative outcomes, not just for specific children, but for society as a whole. And then the author goes on to provide evidence for that refutation. So that's a good example of bringing in a counter argument and then refuting it to strengthen your own claim, your own argument. Another article you guys looked at on your own to identify claim and argument was this article, Emoticons in Language, and we got the claim really in the headline here. Emoticons aren't ruining language, they're revolutionizing it. So some people noticed and pointed out that the author kind of begins with counter-argument by showing us how a lot of major media outlets bemoan the ways in which people communicate through technology. They don't like what technology has done. And yet the central claim of this piece is that these things are actually strengthening language. So you can see this writer is almost starting with counter-argument. That's not something I will recommend for you guys as we're learning how to write arguments, but a professional writer can do that. It's an interesting hook into a central claim. So let's take a look at some information. So first I wanted to start with some definitions. So counter-argument and refutation. Counter-argument is an argument that runs counter to your own. So here in this first bullet point, an argument, counter-argument is an argument that opposes your own claim. That's why the word counter appears before it. It runs opposite to your own claim. A refutation is something that knocks down the counter-argument. So you can see this complete sentence here. When you bring in an opposing viewpoint in order to knock it down, you are using the strategy of counter-argument and refutation in your writing. So you guys will have access to this slideshow to look at these definitions a little bit more clearly, but a couple of things I want to point out. The only reason we would bring in an opposing viewpoint or an opposing claim is in order to refute it. So counter-argument only works alongside refutation. You can't bring in a counter-argument and expect your audience to understand why you've done that. You have to show them that you've done it to explain why it's wrong. This technique is part of logos. If you remember the appeals that we learned, ethos, pathos, and logos, this would be an appeal to logos. It's a logical thing to do. Even though it sounds strange to bring in the opposition, to bring in something that's the opposite of what you're trying to prove, When done right, it's actually really logical. It shows your audience that you've researched every possibility, even those who oppose your claim, and you have proven them wrong. And here's why. Counterargument is introduced in writing using signal language. You want to signal to your audience that you're bringing in an opposing claim. So in this case, some of the most common signal language that you'll see includes things like some argue, some claim, some assert, some others. Opponents argue, claim, contend, or assert, and it has been argued or claimed by others. So you bring that signal language up first so that your audience is ready for a counter argument. And then once you decide you're going to refute it, once you're ready to refute the counter argument, you also use signal language to turn back to your own claim. The most common signal language for refutation is however. It's a clear signal in one word that you're about to go tell me something that is the opposite, right? It's an oppositional transition word. Okay, so here we have an example. So this comes from a familiar piece, Counterargument and Refutation from Letter from Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King Jr. Many people argue that Letter from Birmingham Jail is essentially entirely counterargument because if you remember, King is responding to a very specific audience, the 8 clergymen who had problems with him and his co-workers coming to Birmingham from outside of Birmingham in order to protest the segregation and the racism that was happening there. So throughout the letter, he really does counter-argue. He brings up their assertions and claims and then explains why they're incorrect. So here's a good paragraph to describe that. And in this beginning, you'll see that kind of signal language. Again, because he's speaking to a specific audience in a letter, he can say your, right? In your statement, you assert that our actions, even though peaceful, must be condemned because they precipitate violence. So that's what you say. And then we have this transitional word here, but, and we understand that what he's about to do is refute their claim. But is this a logical assertion? Isn't this like condemning a robbed man because his possession of money precipitated the evil act of robbery? Isn't this like condemning Socrates because his unswerving commitment to truth and his philosophical inquiries precipitated the act by the misguided populace in which they made him drink hemlock, which is a form of poison? Isn't this like condemning Jesus because his unique God consciousness and never ceasing devotion to God's will precipitated the evil act of crucifixion? We must come to see that, as the federal courts have consistently affirmed, it is wrong to urge an individual to cease his efforts to gain his basic constitutional rights because the quest may precipitate violence. Society must protect the robbed and punish the robber. So King uses an interesting technique in his refutation by asking a series of questions. And within those questions, he brings up sort of obvious examples about why the clergyman's assertion that a peaceful protest precipitates violence is incorrect, to blame those who protest. So within the questions, he brings up the examples of Socrates and Jesus, but ultimately he's refuting their claim. So that's a good example of counter-argument and refutation. So here we have another paragraph. This time I'm going to have you guys decide where you're seeing the counter-argument and the refutation in each of these labeled sentences. So we have a thesis statement here about solar energy, and it's pro-solar energy. The thesis reads, government agencies should invest in solar energy because it is cost-effective and environmentally beneficial. So this person writing this piece believes in solar energy, but this would be a paragraph from the essay that includes some counter-argument. So I'd like you to read through this. We have 3 sentences labeled here, and you'll answer questions about which is counter-argument, which is refutation, and so on. So I'll read the paragraph aloud for you. Some critics of solar energy argue that solar energy does have some drawbacks, including pollution created by the transportation and production of solar panels and the relative expense of panels. According to Maggie Koth-Baker in National Geographic News, solar energy is the most expensive form of electricity among current technologies for new electricity generation, about $396 per megawatt hour for PV. However, despite the potentially high cost, solar energy is still the only available energy resource that is both renewable and has no carbon footprint, at least in its energy conversion process. In addition, government incentives, such as tax credits to homeowners who install solar panel systems, make solar energy more affordable for families in the long run. Such incentives, along with continued investment in technological advances, are driving down the cost of panels, making them more affordable for businesses and individuals. So we don't really have to understand the topic completely in order to identify the counterargument and refutation. Okay, so now you guys are going to read a full editorial called Expanding Community College Access. It will be posted for you to read, and you are going to identify the counterargument paragraph. So you're going to take the skills we just learned and went over and apply them to a full editorial to see where the counterargument is and how the author refutes it.